This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. All right, welcome back to Transparency. We took a bit of a spring break, but we are back and very grateful to be back here with Debbie Hayton, someone we've known from Twitter for a long time, and just the general small swimming pool that is the wrong kind of trans, let's say. Debbie here is the only autogynephile, it seems, or at least the only person willing to kind of talk about that experience openly, while the rest of, anyway, no judgment. I can understand why that's such a difficult thing for most people to talk about, but very grateful you're doing it, and welcome to Transparency.
Oh, you're very welcome, Aaron. Nice to be with you both.
It's nice to finally meet you, because we've been interacting online for so long, and this is the first time we've had a chance to just sit and have a conversation.
Well, it is, isn't it? You send brief messages and text messages, but it's good to be able to talk to people as properly as we can across on the opposite sides of the Atlantic.
So where should we get started? I'm a terrible interviewer.
Yeah.
Well, what we were talking about originally is that we all three see transition, or what we've done, in a very similar way. That we're all three happy with where we are. I mean, there certainly regrets here and there with details of the process, for sure. But I mean, ultimately, not to put words in people's mouths, but kind of like we know that what we did was a fallacy. It may not have been a good decision for our health, may not have been a good decision for our for the people in our lives, our families, and close relationships and whatnot. But we made that decision. We now see that maybe we should have handled it entirely differently when we did it, but we've done it. We don't regret where we are now, but I'm kind of spitballing here, and somebody else pick up the rope. You know what I'm talking about?
I think, yeah, I know what you're talking about, Aaron. It's yeah, I can emphasize what you're saying. I transitioned because I thought there was some kind of woman, and I thought I had to transition to find my inner self and let myself, all those tropes that we hear. I would have said every one of them. 10 years down the line, I realized I'm no kind of woman, and the promise, what transition promised, it didn't deliver. It delivered something else, and it delivered me as the person I am now. And I'm quite happy with who I am, and I'm content with who I am. And if I hadn't transitioned, then I would be somebody else now, and I don't want to be somebody else. So I guess it's made me who I am, and I'll work with it. But it didn't. Just let's say it didn't fulfill the promises which I was assured it would deliver. It didn't.
What do you think some of those promises were that you anticipated?
Well, I think that it would fulfill me as an individual, so I'd be whole and I'd be complete. I was already fulfilled as an individual. There's only me here, and there's only ever been me here. In its also what it was promised, that I was going through a really tough time mentally 10 years ago, and transition was promised as the solution to all this, and it really didn't. It was a plan, it was a strategy, it was a mission almost I was on, to actually do this and tick things off on a list, but it didn't bring contentment and psychological fulfillment with who I was. The only thing that did that was self-awareness that came later. And I said that transition itself was didn't fulfill its promises. What it did do, it forced me into a level of introspection and a level of just self-analysis, which actually I did find out who I was and why I was doing this, that I don't think I would have done if I'd transitioned. If I hadn't transitioned. So although it didn't fulfill its promises directly, I think it's left me now 10 years on in a pretty good place. I'm content with who I am. I'm self-aware, and I'm happy with who I am. And the psychological torment, which I was going through 10 years ago, is a lifetime away.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
How did you understand what trans was at that time, at the time that you transitioned?
What I thought it was at the time, I'd bought this born in the wrong body, philosophy. I was convinced I had this female gender identity, which had been, by some misfortune, I'd picked up the wrong kind of body when the bodies were given out. And I had to transition to put that right. That's what I believed. So I was pretty orthodox in my views as far as trans people go, and that's what I believed, and that's what I did. That's why I did what I did. But it was a belief. And this was the issue. When friends and relatives were saying, well, what is this? And why are you doing this? I couldn't really answer. And that always left me in a position of greater turmoil, really, that I knew I had to do something and I knew I was going to do it, but I really didn't know why. And when anybody tried to quiz me and say, why are you doing this, really? I had no answers apart from, I've got to do it because I've got to do it. And as somebody like me, that was not very, it was not very satisfying, to say the least.
Yeah, I had the same experience with that kind of compulsion that you must do this, and then when somebody comes along that's kind of like kind of puts the reality of it back in your face and is like, what does this even mean? Why are you doing this? You realize, well, you don't even let yourself realize that it's not true. You do some sort of mental loophole to be able to continue in the trajectory that you want to be continuing on towards transition. It very much feels like this is something I have to do. I can't really articulate why. And you just continue and continue.
And it becomes a project. So this is a project. First of all, you do this. You change your presentation a bit. You change some documents. You change more documents. You take some hormones. You get yourself on a list for this surgery. It's a project, and you get on with it, and this becomes the focus of your life. It's the next step on from this. You get to the end of that project, and then you think, what was all that about? And that's why I worry about. I worry about other trans people, because you get to the end of that, and it was a project, and I got to the end, and I was really no closer to working out who I was or why I was doing it.
So it occurred to me that, before I transitioned, I was in the butch femme scene, and a lot of the butches that I'd known over the years described an experience that sounded very similar to mine of kind of modeling their identities around the males in their lives, not the females in their lives, and presented very masculine, often had male nicknames, used male pronouns. They were clear that they were women, and everyone in the community was clear that they were women, but a very masculine identity. And when you're surrounded by that kind of community and seeing that exist in the community, before I learned about trans, that's how I made sense of it. Is this must be just something related to homosexuality, because there's lots of effeminate gay men and lots of butch women who seem to have a similar experience of childhood gender dysphoria that I did. But that must not be the case for those with autogynephilia, because I don't imagine there's a community of men who openly talk about it.
No, no, it's not. It's not the sort of thing that men talk about. I think it's more common than people realize. I think autogynephilia is. It's not. It's unusual, but it happens. But men don't talk about it. To talk about wanting to become a woman and fancying yourself, which is effectively what it is. It's being sexually attracted to yourself. This is taboo for men. Men don't talk about this at all, and I think that's part of the problem, in that we've got these issues going on, but men don't talk about it. Perhaps if we talked about it a bit more, we might understand ourselves a bit more. But trans would be a fine thing.
Not that it made any difference for me, because I still transitioned, but. But that was because, you said you understood trans based on the cultural narrative. And of course we would. That was the only publicly endorsed explanation for what we experienced was this, gender identity concept. Or I didn't really believe in a gender identity. I believed in more the medical model. I thought, well, there must be something neurologically different about our brains that caused, gender identity disorder, and that's why we experience this. But what the pivotal moment for me was, I was sitting there watching a documentary on TV about trans kids, and they were describing this experience. They didn't call it gender dysphoria, but they described that experience, and it's like, well, that's exactly what I experienced as a kid. And they framed it as, if you have these experiences, it doesn't mean you have gender dysphoria. That's not how they framed it. It means that you're a trans person. And it was like a light bulb went off. I mean, I was at a kind of a vulnerable time in my life, so maybe a little more gullible than I might have been otherwise. But that was and has been the narrative since then, is you are a trans person as a type of personhood if you experience this. And so it completely flipped my identity from, okay, so I'm not actually a dyke after all, I'm actually this trans person because I obviously have this experience that they were describing. So that seemed like a really logical conclusion to draw when it seems like our whole world is sending us this message that experience means you are a trans person. And then it became important to me to transition, because that's what would differentiate me from the butch lesbians.
Yeah, that concept of the trans person, I think, is so important, yet it's such a fallacy, to create this separate type of people who have got some special knowledge about themselves. We're credited with almost having superhuman powers in being able to discern what it means to be trans, and be able to pass judgment on things that other people can't. And it is nonsense. The idea that there is a type of person who is trans, a trans person. And you can go back from there one step, as you did. You've got a person who is struggling with gender dysphoria. But we can also go back one step from there and say, what is this thing called gender dysphoria? It was an artificial diagnosis, really, to keep some treatment. Once medicine has got a treatment protocol, it needs to have a diagnosis in order to access it. That's where medicine works. So they created gender identity disorder, which was, well, we don't like having disorders, do we not? We don't want to be disordered. We all want to be ordered in line. That's what we want to be. So it was renamed gender dysphoria. And it's talking about becoming gender incongruence if it hasn't already become. But really, there was just behind this, there is the psychological conditions, who knows how many of those there are. And the symptom of those is this compulsion to transition. And if we started talking about this compulsion to transition, we may strip some of the mystique from it, and then say, well, what is going on here? Why do people of both sexes have this bizarre compulsion to transition, to present themselves in the same way as the opposite sex? Why? What's going on here? How can we help these people? And can we talk to these people to try and understand what's going on? But it seems to me, Aaron, by creating this person, this trans person, we just bypass all that. So we affirm people's inexpert self-diagnosis, and we understand nothing. It's tragic, really.
I keep going back to how much of it, I think so the vast majority of this is fueled by adding the T to the LGBT, and it just turns people's brains off as to what trans is, what, gender dysphoria is many different things that we call the same thing, but it's clearly coming from very different internal experiences. But because of that association, the T with the LGB, it's like, if you ask someone why do you want to transition? It's like, well, because I'm trans. They conceptualize it like you're trying to ask somebody, well, why are you attracted to the same sex? That's obviously quite offensive, but and so if you apply that same logic to why do you want to transition, it's bigoted to address why somebody wants to take these really just dramatic medical steps for why,
Yeah, and why? And we just don't ask those. We just don't ask enough questions of people to say, why do you want to do this? And what's the psychological driver behind this? We don't understand that, because the research doesn't happen because you're questioning somebody's identity. denying somebody's and invalidating somebody's, it's somebody. And it's not that at all. What we're trying to do is, what we should be trying to do is trying to understand people, so that if we, as understanding, will help people understand themselves and live with their own bodies. We can make cosmetic changes to our bodies, but we're effectively the same people in the same bodies that we've ever been. And how can we help people live that life better without, and we've got to be honest here, without making some pretty drastic changes to our bodies, which come with significant health risks at the time. Down the line, who knows what the long-term prognosis are for trans people, because nobody's done any research into it. And the impact on our families is really profound. As a trans friend said to me when I transitioned, you got to remember that your families transition at the same time and they get no benefit from it whatsoever. Yeah, all this goes on, and we just don't ask these questions. And I just find it really unsatisfactory. And so I make my statements really just to make a point. I've got my T-shirt that got me into a lot of hot water. So trans women are men, get over it. Oh dear me, that got me into a lot of bother, did that. But really, I've taken it one step further. It should say that trans women are men with a psychological disorder. Get over it. And if we get over those psychological disorders and don't see them as pejoratives, just saying them the peculiarities that make us who we are, then we really can understand ourselves and be ourselves, rather than trying to deny this. Because it just seems to me that if we don't ask these questions and we don't try to understand ourselves, then we're the ones who are denying ourselves, because we're creating some fallacy that we're really the opposite sex when we're not.
At what point did you learn about autogynephilia and realize that fit your?
Oh, I knew about it when I was transitioning. So, I got involved in trans groups around 2010, 2011, other groups. And autogynephilia was sort of thing that was talked about, but not talked about. It was a huge elephant in the room. And it was almost from the male to female trans people. Male transsexuals, call us what you like, I don't really mind. It almost seemed to be that there was good transsexuals and these sort of autogynephiles, but we don't want to talk about those. Those were a different group, and we separated ourselves off from that. And it's artificial because you can't. So I knew about it. at the time, but sort of said that's nothing to do with me. To me, autogynephiles were men with gross psychological problems that manifested themselves in ways that my transsexualism didn't manifest itself in me, really. And so I just didn't identify with that public face of autogynephilia which I saw. So I denied it and thought it was nothing to do with me. Later, I started reading about it and looking at it. And every time you read about it, you read a bit more. You eventually put it down. You keep putting it down because you really don't want to read anymore. But I kept reading a bit more and thinking, oh, maybe. But no, that was always the case. And then it was a conversation with Miranda Yardley, another male transsexual. I don't know if you've talked to Miranda.
Directly, yeah.
Yeah, and Miranda kept saying, have you read Anne Lawrence's stuff? And I said, no. And so Miranda kept trying to persuade me to read Anne Lawrence, who is transsexual, but also somebody who accepts the autogynephilic drivers in there. So I read some of Anne Lawrence's work, and I thought there might be something here. But I think, so that was 2017, 2018. It was after I started campaigning publicly on this, and I'd become more aware of who I was. I was more confident in who I was. And you start reading this thinking, yeah. And I think the point was when I realized that by its nature, autogynephilia wasn't a negative outworking of the overconsumption of porn, which I think is sometimes understood. How I understand it now is it's almost like that stands on its head. Rather than saying men men look at too much porn and it gets worse and worse and worse in a cycle, and then it drives autogynephilia. I think it's the other way around. I think autogynephilia is something which I think is innate, and I think it's within us, and I think men with interest in porn can obviously pick up on those. On those sort of genres, and it can exacerbate it. But I think it's something which is there, and I think it's something which is within us. And men can be sexually attracted to anything, really. And I sometimes tell the story of a friend who worked, in the emergency room in a hospital, saying the objects that men came in with stuck into various orifices, and there was a story about this man had turned up with this ketchup bottle rammed up his nether regions, and he was trying to say to the nurses in the emergency room that he'd been shaking it, and he slipped and he fell on it and it got stuck. And they said, "Don't worry, we've seen this before. We know how to extract these things without causing further damage. Don't worry about it." So men can be attracted to anything. Why not their own bodies? And there's worse things. There's worse situations than that, as we can imagine. Nobody else is involved. But
how I think it took me a while to understand it as innate. But the way that I conceptualize this, and tell me if it's incorrect, but I think obviously, most people are born, heterosexual. So obviously you were born heterosexual, but with this additional kink in your brain, not kink in the sexy way, but like just a flipped wire that makes that outward attraction go inward. So it's like two things that are happening simultaneously. Again, stop me if this doesn't make sense, but rather than thinking that autogynephilia, this like, as we would say, like a fetish, is innate, it's the case that heterosexuality is innate, and the compulsion, or not the compulsion, that's the wrong word, but the automatic inversion of that heterosexuality is a different mechanism happening, because you see a lot of autoandrophilia in gay men. So I think that potential to have the sexual target be reversed is something that can happen, maybe more than we think, in males. And so I think when those two things, that sexual inversion and heterosexuality collide, those two things are innate, and I think that's what is autogynephilia. Is that accurate, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say it was accurate. I think it's not that your sexuality is completely directed inwards. It's not true. Right. Men can be attracted to multiple women. Heterosexual men will, their attraction can be to many people. Middle-aged men have affairs in huge numbers. And there's some sort of biological driver to that, I'm sure. So the fact that a man can be happily married and then have an affair with somebody else, and they do, the analogy here is some man who's married and someone who's been married for many years suddenly comes out as trans. Well, maybe he's just having an affair with himself. That's the that's the analogy. And when you work through those parallels, actually, it's pretty it's pretty striking when you're looking at the man who suddenly has an affair with somebody else and can't help himself and will risk all sorts in order to do that. Yet the autogynephile then transitions in midlife and takes exactly the same risks with relationships and with family and with employment even to do that. The outworkings are different, but the parallels are very strong.
So we, like, obviously I understand that autogynephilia competes with the regular heterosexual drive, but you're essentially saying that the internal projection of that attraction can just be one of the many female objects you're attracted to, essentially. And then I imagine for some that's more intense than others, right? Like, so that the competition towards, the attraction towards other people pales in comparison to the inward attraction, or then it can be the opposite, whereas like somebody may have some autogynephilic tendencies, but it's very minor relative to their external attractions.
Yeah, and it's these competing attractions. Why does this happen? I've sometimes said that my sort of gender dysphoria, if we want to go back and use that, it was something that was all there's always, I've always had these issues, but they were chronic and livable with, and you could just put them to one side, you could compartmentalize them. But once you start looking into it, and once you start thinking about it, you ruminate on it. And once you start ruminating on it, it does take over. And what actually drove it from something which was a chronic condition which I'd lived with for years to something which I just couldn't resist was knowing that transition was possible. It was a compulsion to transition. Not sure why that compulsion came from. I'm still trying to work it out, from psychological principles. Why did this happen? What caused this? But I've said, I think I've said publicly that if the prospect of medical transition wasn't available, I wouldn't have. It probably wouldn't have crossed my mind. I would have just carried on with life and just not really thought about it. But it was when I became aware that medical transition was possible, and not only possible, but people like me were doing it, then suddenly I needed to do it too. Suddenly I was very jealous of other people who were doing it, and saw this. Well, if this other person can do this, I need to do this too. I do wonder that if the treatment was, if the treatment wasn't there, I wouldn't have had the need for it. And it does seem to me that medical transition is a treatment that does generate its own demand. If it wasn't there, then, well, we'd just get on with life, wouldn't we? It's the very fact that it's there means that we need to do it. And it was in my early 40s, about 10 years ago, that I realized it was there and it was a realistic possibility. And once I realized that, then there was nothing that really could hold me back.
I had the exact same experience that you've described. I heard you describe it more in additional detail in other interviews. And I had the exact, so I've never had any sort of autoeroticism, like that's not a portion of it, but you described having this obviously intense desire to be a woman. It's almost like feeling that the mistake had been made, but it was a very shameful thing that you managed, you kept internal, greatest desire, but you couldn't ever achieve it. So it was just something that you kind of just didn't pay that much attention to. You could compartmentalize it. But yeah, again, it was something that came with an immense amount of shame. And I had that exact same experience. And it was also the same year. Well, no, I think that was 2011 when I realized that it was an actual possibility. And once I realized it was a possibility, it was literally, it was impossible to compartmentalize it. And also, because so many other people were doing it, the shame I always had for feeling that way disappeared. It was like, so both the shame going and the compulsion, just be overwhelming. It was like, suddenly I had to tell everybody about it and I had to just go and do it. And then, so yeah, then you got that a bit of, I didn't have a spouse or kids to think about. I was 27 years old, single. I just had friends and I was an adult, so my family didn't weigh that much about it. But everybody was quite supportive and positive. My dad was the only person who was just like, he said he loved me and supported me and everything, but it's like, are you sure this is a good, he was like raising up concerns and criticisms, but I was like, no, that's all fine. No, it's all great. But that was the only resistance I came up against was my dad. And, but even that was very minimal. So it was just like full steam ahead. There was, but I know exactly what you mean. It's like that feeling of, I've always wanted this. It's actually possible. Oh my God, this is so exciting. And there's nothing that could get in your way. Yeah.
Yep. I empathize with that entirely, Aaron. Yep. Once it becomes a possibility, you've got to do it. Yep. And this is why I'm concerned about what's happening with children. When I was a child, children didn't transition, so there was no demand for it. There was no demand created. Medical transition was not possible for children. Everybody knew that it wasn't possible. You had to grow up first and find out who you were and become an adult, understand what it meant to be an adult first. Whereas now we're making this treatment available to children, and the psychological impact on me in my 40s, once I realized the treatment was available, if I'd been aware of that as a child, then the just thought of that is horrifying, really. And that's one reason I've been campaigning quite strongly against pediatric transition of any type. I don't think this is something that kids should be doing. And despite the fact that 10 years on, I think I'm sane, I'm capable, I'm contributing to society. So you can say, well, transition's worked for you, Debbie, and you don't have any plans to unwind it anytime soon. That's the fact that I transitioned once I was an adult, and I understood what it meant to be an adult. And I really do worry what's happening with children and the impact of the availability of that treatment on them. So what you've said there, Aaron, you were you were an adult, you were fully mature, psychologically mature as an adult. If that possibility had been opened up to you when you were, say, 12 or 13, then it's a different matter altogether, isn't it? And how do you then cope with growing up, finding yourself, finding your place in society with this going on as well? I really do worry about kids. I think what's happening is a scandal.
Not only what's happening to their bodies, when you're already fully, your body's fully formed, and then you make this decision. That's an entirely different ballgame than halting puberty and just really interfering with the course of normal body development. So that's one facet of this. The other thing why that's one of many reasons I'm totally against pediatric transition. But another thing is I know what I was thinking when I was 27 years old. Again, as a fully mature adult, I can fully relate with how I felt then. I understand it. Like I was making a fully informed decision as best as you could, given that compulsive drive. But if I had been offered that decision at 12 or 14 and my parents had facilitated it, I do not know. I would never know as an adult if that was actually necessary. I would never know if I had outgrown it, if I could be physically fully whole, And so if you're a child, it isn't your decision. So that decision is being taken from them. So it's a completely different ballgame from my perspective.
The pushback that I hear from trans people who don't quite understand kind of the bigger picture that we're talking about, a lot of them say, well, I would have benefited from transitioning as a younger person. And it's so easy. If you've transitioned as an adult and you're happy with your transition, it's easy to imagine yourself as that 10-year-old or 5-year-old or 16-year-old and imagine benefits of transitioning. And I would have done that probably, 5 years ago, even imagined, because I definitely had that early childhood type onset gender dysphoria. And I think, well, if I had been on puberty blockers, then I wouldn't have needed a double mastectomy. And then I wouldn't have had the scars. And maybe I would have integrated better with my peers in high school. But the part of the public narrative isn't that, the 11 studies that childhood gender kids with childhood onset gender dysphoria, 60 to 90% of them desist, by or through adolescence. I mean, those are the parts of the evidence and the narrative that is missing from the public conversation. Why would we transition kids? Like, even if some of them would end up benefiting later in life as adults, we have no way of predicting which of those 10% would benefit and which won't. So why would we transition all of these kids, when 60 to 90% of them would have just resolved it and moved on with healthy bodies? And it's not about conversion therapy. It's about what's wrong with avoiding lifelong medicalization.
Well, quite. And what we're almost told, what children are almost told, is you can choose which sort of puberty to go through. So you can go through this puberty and become a woman, or you can go through that puberty to become a man. But only one can leave you as a fertile adult, able to have more children, able to have children of your own. These are not equivalent pathways. One requires constant medication, which is working against the way in which your body naturally produces hormones and naturally develops. So you're working against that. And it's not possible for you to have children of your own. I'm sometimes said that, I'm sometimes accused of talking too much about this, but I think there's a biological driver in in many adults to have our own children. If it wasn't there, the human race would rapidly die out, I guess. So I don't think the two pathways are equivalent, even though trans organizations can sometimes say that they are. We're going back to this concept of the trans person. You are a trans person, therefore. This is quite profound, very profound treatment that causes massive changes to your body, leaves you on medication. And I just don't think that it's the sort of thing that we should be putting children in. And Aaron, you're quite right in that all the studies show that the vast majority of cases of childhood gender dysphoria, it evaporates in adolescence. And, we don't have the large, we've got a lot, looking at what's happening among girls, the outbreaks of what Lisa Lippman referred to, rapid onset gender dysphoria in these groups of teenage girls. All I hear from my female friends in their 40s and 50s is they felt detached from their sex in the same way that they were when they were children, but they've grown out of it, and they've no great wish to transition now. Why would you want to do that? Yet we're saying to children, unless you make this decision now, your life may be ruined. And I think it's wrong. And I think I come back to it. I think what's happening with children is very, very wrong. And it is a scandal. We hear a lot about the impact on women's rights, and I'm sympathetic to women and maintaining their sex-based rights. But when I look at what's happening with children, I think this is a much bigger issue. Mm-hmm. Children, women can reclaim that. Women are in a position to reclaim those rights. Whereas once you've medicated and sterilized a child before puberty, they can never get that life back. We only ever live once, and I think it's wrong what's happening. Mm-hmm.
Even aside from the infertility issues, because not everyone necessarily wants to have kids, but I mean, these procedures aren't perfect. I mean, when you're left with scar tissue and, loss of sensation and or chronic pain from some of these surgical procedures, or the long-term effects of hormone use, we really don't know. Like if someone starts hormones at age 14 and so they're on it for a much longer period of time, we really don't know the impact on mortality or their health when they're 50 or 60. So it's such an experiment. It's really an uncontrolled experiment. But I think the part that I probably object to the most is the ideological part of it. I mean, the fact that we as adults bought into this lie that there's such a that the gender ideology. Well, what chance do the kids have if that's not what's being presented to them, is that everybody has a gender identity and you can just pick which sex you are? Like it's such a ridiculous notion, and it's such a vague concept. I mean, what is gender identity then? If I'm a little girl that has some masculine personality traits, like does that mean my gender identity is male? Like it's such a, whereas gender dysphoria, if we study it and articulate it, it can be more specific. But gender identity is such a broad, vague concept that anyone in theory could opt into the opposite sex for any reason.
Do you think that might be what the explosion of the non-binary identities in teenage girls is because they've absorbed this notion of everybody has a gender identity and you can pick which one, and you're balancing that masculine interest versus feminine interest, and then so obviously the vast majority of people, if they're trying to balance their masculine and feminine interest, the vast majority of us are going to be non-binary. That's just kind of how human beings work. So that was a bit of a sidestep. Go on, Debbie.
No, well, isn't everybody non-binary really?
Right?
Is anybody the full-on caricature of what it needs to be, male or female? And I don't think any of us are. I think in some regards, we're all non-binary. But what we're doing here is it's like what we said about creating this trans person. We've also created this non-binary person as somebody with special knowledge or special characters, where what you're saying is you don't fit the stereotypes. Well, it's great. None of us should be forced into fitting stereotypes, but we shouldn't then be inventing a new gender to identify into as some sort of excuse. And I think that's where it gets sad, where teenage, you two are gonna, you two are far, well, you two have knowledge about what it means to be a teenage girl. I don't. But what from observing this is that being a teenage boy, you're getting the better deal the whole time than being a teenage girl. And I can see why people want to opt out of that. I can see why girls want to opt out of it without necessarily wanting to be a boy, because that's a big thing. But to opt out of this of what it means to be a teenage girl growing into a woman, and the expectations and the temptation to be able to opt out of those must be quite big. And if you can say I'm non-binary, and that removes you from those expectations, I can see the attraction, but it's from a distance. And I'm talking to people who talking to you two who've been through this, whereas I haven't.
Well, and I think it's even worse though, because when all three of us were teenagers, there was no social media, there was no inundation of online porn, and I think what teenage girls are going through now is way worse than anything Aaron or I or our peers, in the 80s and 90s and early aughts experienced. And I really, they're fed all sort, like just the mental health crisis in girls that's caused by social media. And I think the kids are seeing porn at such young ages, and it's violent, and they're traumatized by it. And it's just it's a lot worse now, I think, to be a teenage girl than it was when we were.
Yeah, I get impression.
Yeah, and you can't get away from it. Social media started on the PC, and you would log in to check your messages, and then you go away from it. Whereas now it follows you around everywhere, and to switch it off, and the fear of missing out of what's being talked about behind your back is huge. And then we had the pandemic, because one place where children are protected from some degree from it is at school, because I'm a teacher, so we've got rules in schools about not having phones, and we're quite strict on that. Now, I'm not so naive to realize that when children disappear off to the toilets during recess, that they will not be checking messages. I'm not that naive, but to some extent, we are protecting them from that, that full-on experience every hour of the day. Whereas then we, in the last 2 years, we closed the schools in Great Britain for 2 full terms, and children were sat at home, presumably working at home, looking at a Zoom screen, getting on with exercises that were set, and at that time, then there was nothing to stop them. Having the lesson going on the screen with their camera blanked out. Meanwhile, their attention was elsewhere, and nothing was there to protect them. And that I worry about the impact of that.
I have heard about, like the rise of a number of different psychological disorders in teenagers through the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, shutting the schools for 2 terms, whether it was necessary or not, it happened. And the consequences, I don't think we've got to the bottom of it, the consequences on that generation of children who, during that formative years, which is so important, were basically stuck at home, living on the internet and lacking that real life interaction with other people. When we really do, when bodies do matter, when you're actually meeting people, when you're eating with people and walking around with people, your bodies do matter. When you're an avatar in a chat group, then it doesn't. And the lockdown experience, exacerbated that, especially in young people. They were living their lives on the internet because our government said you can't go out, you can't meet your friends, you can't do these normal things that children do. It was forbidden by law. So I really do worry about the consequences on children, and some of the impact now and the mental health crisis now must be due to that.
I lurk on trans activist Twitter sometimes, especially with the young people, and just to get a sense of what they're saying and how they're thinking. And I've noticed that a lot of them are using, that avatar language, or like the gaming language in regards to transition, that it's a skin and you can just switch out skins.
Yeah.
So it's quite alarming, this you know, the online mediated impact on identity development, that it is so disembodied.
Yeah, and it affects the way that you interact with everybody else. You change that skin, and people talk to you differently. You interact with other people differently, and this could, you know, this is this could be self-exploration. But when you're when you realize you have a real body, that moderates those experiences. You then become a boy who's trying to find out how it feels to some extent to be a girl and vice versa. But you realize that because you're there with a real physical body, you haven't really changed your sex. But if you're living in this, you know, in this second world, second life environment, then you can do what you like, supposedly. And but then you've got to come back to reality, because it's in the real world where we eat, we sleep, we yeah, you form relationships with each other. We are complete human beings. We're body as well as mind. You know, the idea that our bodies are just some sort of devices to move our minds around this face of the earth. It's not true. It's a heresy that goes back. It's a heresy that goes back years. Is that?
Mhm.
And but it's easy to get there when you're living online. But we can't detach ourselves from reality. You know, we've got real bodies that we need to look after, we need to feed, we need to clothe, we need to you know, and it's because we've got real bodies that we're attracted to other people with real bodies. That's what goes on in real life. And to separate ourselves out from that, I think is it's setting ourselves up for problems, as we're seeing.
Two things I just thought of is when we were talking about earlier about that disassociation of living online. Helena Kirshner talks a lot about that experience of like basically living online, and so it's very easy to kind of disassociate from her body and just basically just be this sort of avatar of a you know, cute boy that she'd created, and then but she had to go to school, and like that would kind of pull her out of it, right? And also that kind of Tumblr life was attractive to the really kind of nerdy or cerebral girls, not the outgoing popular ones. But then in the time of COVID, it's not just the indoorsy cerebral kids who were on their phones all day long. It was all the kids, you know. And so I wonder how that's impacted maybe the more, you know, normie type. I don't know. Like I'm not kind of, this just occurred to me, but I'm wondering how many more kids that wouldn't have been swept up in this were swept up in it because they were not allowed to be in real life amongst people they really know. And then the other thing, what you were just saying, is about that kind of about the physicality of your body and the physicality of other people's bodies. Certainly as a teenager, when you're developing sexuality and sexual feelings, to just live online where you are disassociated from your body. And I think that's where we get this sort of like this new kind of liberal moral that basically if everybody isn't bisexual, you are you know, a bigot. You know, I think that has a lot to do with it, is because they have not ever physically experienced genuine, you know, attraction to somebody, you know, like, or at least not much, you know. And so it's like everything else in their lives, it's a completely abstract concept. It's not rooted in their actual physical bodies and other people's physical bodies. So I'm wondering if that has something to do with our new understanding, or the contemporary, you know, understanding of genitals are irrelevant in sex. You know, I think that could have something to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, two things happened at the same time. One is that social media became ever more intense and more easily accessible. And secondly, we cut people off from reality. And we are social beings, and we do look for community, and we do look for society. We need friends, we need family. You know, we can't exist in a vacuum by ourselves. It's what this attraction between people is. You know, human beings are complex. You know, we are attracted to people of our own sex. We're attracted to people of the opposite sex, and this level of attraction between people has evolved into us. If it wasn't there, as I said, you know, the human race would die out. So there are differences in the way that the two sexes relate to each other, people with different types of body. But you get online and there's no need for two sexes online. There can be any number of different genders and patterns and trends online. And but we can't reproduce online. That's the problem.
Hey, I can create a bunch of different accounts.
Well, you can. You reproduce yourself. You can, can't you? Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me about some of your recent writing, you described what your experience was like as a child, and despite the fact we have two different pathways to gender dysphoria, I was perhaps surprised and interested in the similarities in our experiences, and I think I was surprised even that you did have memories of gender dysphoria as a child, because I had always been under the impression that AGP emerges in adolescence. Do you have contact with other people with AGP who would say that, who could point to something in their childhood?
Well, the problem is it's getting people to admit that they've got AGP. I can look at them and think, yeah. But we'll just not go there. So people will use the fact that they've got early memories of struggles with gender, struggles with their sex as proof that they're not autogynephile. Whereas I'm thinking, well, no, it's we are who we are, and this is part of our character. It's part of who we are and how we relate to ourselves and others. So I put it this way: I don't know enough people who are quite happy to say, yeah, I'm an autogynephile, to say that, yes, they've got the childhood experiences as well. But I hear enough people who are saying that the fact I've got these childhood experiences means that I'm not autogynephile. I'm thinking, no, it doesn't. And I don't think that we change in our, I don't think our sexuality changes in its nature so much at puberty. It just grows in intensity, so what's already there just grows more intense. And I think that's what happens. So what happens in young children, it's, I've memories myself from when I was young, but it wasn't something that gripped me. It was when I got into adolescence and my testosterone level went up from on the scale we use here from what it was from diddly squat. I was at the top of the male range, so very rapidly, and that has such a huge impact on you. It grips you, does that? But it didn't change so much. The way that I relate. I remember as a 6-7-year-old boy, I would relate to boys differently to girls. I knew that there were two sexes. We all knew there were two sexes as 5 and 6-year-olds. And girls and boys relate to their own sex differently to their other sex. So this is the way these relationships work. And, to say that, that children of, prepubescent children, 5, 6, 7-year-old children, there's no difference between boys and girls. Well, it's nonsense, isn't it? You can see that. You can see, if you put some children out in the playground, of mixed sex, you'll see the girls interacting differently to the boys. Now, some girls will be running around with the boys, playing soccer with the boys. Some girls will do that, and fine. And some boys will want to sit and read and quietly. But there is a difference in the way that the sexes as a whole interact with each other. So that starts early. And if that starts early, I don't see why, the way that we interact with our own bodies and are attracted to our own bodies, that shouldn't start early either. But what happens at puberty is the intensity increases. And that's what happens in autogynephilia. The intensity increases at puberty.
This is why I find I get in trouble for constantly calling autogynephilia a sexual orientation, but it helps it make sense. Like I feel like, just like a gay kid is going, like a gay boy is going to develop crushes. This happens, crushes on other boys. Kids, they develop crushes on, you can tell an orientation, right? Like it's not sexual at that age, but the orientation's there, and that you are drawn to, infatuated with, typically, the sex that you will later grow up and want to have sex with. But at before puberty, it's entirely chaste and just infatuation, and so it's at puberty so that's why I think autogynephilia is the same as a sexual orientation, is that you can, like you were saying, Debbie, you were just enamored by little girls' clothes. You didn't know why. You thought it was weird and you knew it was shameful and you shouldn't be, but you were just obsessed with clothes that the girls were wearing. And so it was only after puberty that there became a sexual connotation with that. Prior to puberty, that orientation, that attraction's there, but it's completely non-sexual. That's my understanding anyway.
Yeah, it's what we mean by sex. You see, this word sex it's what's caused these problems. It's a prurience over talking about sexuality and sexual intercourse. So we even created, we've created this word gender to try and de-sex sex. I just think it's unnecessary. We look in Great Britain at the United States as being more prurient than we are on this. But we are to some extent as well. But when you talk about sexuality, it's not just copulation. It's the way in which we react as human beings to other human beings of the same sex and different sex, and the opposite sex, and we do react differently. And it's part of our nature and it's part of our psychology to do that. What I find interesting about me is that I as growing up and even now, I interact with women like other men do. I didn't transition to be anything like a woman at all. And the more I live in transition, the more I realize I'm not like women at all. And my friends are still mainly men, and my interests are far more typically male interests than female interests. But having said that, I'm a physicist. I did a degree in what's more typically attracts more men than women. But I'm married to a female physicist who, and she will say that when she was growing up, most of her friends were boys, and and her friends now are generally men, but that doesn't make her a man. She's a woman who's got interests which some of her interests are more typical of men. It was just the way I came at this, in the same, well, actually my interest, I didn't transition for anything other than it was just to make my body more, to be more comfortable with my body, I guess. But I am still very typically male in who I am and what I do and how I interact with other people.
Yeah, it is frustrating how squeamish people get as soon as you talk about sexuality, that people do automatically kind of leap to, just the basic act of having sex. But so it's hard to talk about these things and how it relates to our sexual orientations without people sort of having an initial knee-jerk reaction, especially when we're talking about kids, because people don't want to think of kids as having any sexuality, like don't call kids gay, or don't say that kids have AGP, and yet people don't seem to be that concerned about the idea of kids being heterosexual.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? We look at homosexuality, and we look at AGP and other forms of transsexualism as being these things that happen, whereas heterosexuality is there as well. But heterosexuality is so ubiquitous, we don't notice it. But our society it's driven by heterosexuality, the way in which men and women react to each other, and even there's no sexual, in like the sexual, it's the wrong word, it's too highly charged, but the way that in the community, in society, groups of men will react to each other differently than groups of women, very much so. Is that sexual? Well, not in the way of sexual intercourse, it isn't, but it's due to our sexuality that we're male and female, and children are sexual as well in that regard.
Yeah, I don't think people realize, I probably don't even realize to the full extent how much social behavior and social organization is actually built around sexual orientation. It just so happens that most people are heterosexual, and our society gets organized like that. And we would see that in any species of animal, and we forget that we are animals with animal drives, right? We're just primates. a little bit smarter than monkeys sometimes, but it's, you know, I've been interested in Paul Vasey's work with just looking at primate behavior and sexuality, and how you know, homosexual behavior in monkeys is often social in nature. It's such a fascinating look at probably our closest cousin, right? And how these things play out in a natural setting without society and our human squeamishness about these things.
Yeah, I read Carole Hooven's book Testosterone. I found it a really good read, that. And when she was talking about the other species and the other great apes and the way in which the juveniles will play with each other, and what we see about, you know, human children playing with each other, well, you know, that groups of juvenile juvenile chimps will play with each other in the same way. And I just found her analysis that really quite captivating. Actually, I was I was captured by her writing, and the idea that we are somewhat different to the other great apes. No, we're not really. We just we hope we're a bit smarter. Sometimes I wonder.
We actually had Carole Hooven on. She's one of our first guests last year. But yeah, that book opened my. I mean, I guess I always understood, obviously, that we're sexually dimorphic mammals, just like other sexually dimorphic mammals, and we're behaving along those lines. But just the extent to that, and then it also really puts you in mind of when we transition, we're really ignoring the fact that we are just sexually dimorphic mammals. Like it's along the lines of other religions where I think we're kind of elevating ourselves above you know, the rest of biology, and that we, you know, somehow the, you know, the laws of biology don't apply to us. We're somehow, you know, whatever is going on in our head is so much more real and important than the physicality of our bodies and what that means for species propagation or whatever else. But yeah, it also, you know, because obviously I think the three of us, me more recently quite a bit, get in the hot water with the feminists, just by how much I talk about how natural the variations between males and females are, and that male sexual aggression is not a facet of societal creation. You know, society exists for the most part, I would say, to mitigate male aggression. And so if society wasn't there, we would be like the chimpanzees, beating each other up. And, you know, like, it's not we Aaron and I wouldn't know, but, you know, like, but you would, Debbie, you know. Yeah,
I think I've heard zookeepers can become quite distressed when they see male chimps beating up the females. You know, they shouldn't be doing this. It was from Hooven's book, where at one point she said that male aggression was natural, but that didn't make it right.
Right.
And I think that was I found that quite profound. We're so used to being natural being good and natural being right, and artificial being bad and artificial being wrong. Yet here we've got something, this male pattern violence, this male aggression is natural because we see it in other species. But just because it's natural doesn't mean to say that it's right. And as a society, we've got to work against our nature at times in order to build a coherent society.
And Carole also has a really good point along those lines: is we have to understand our nature. We have to understand our base impulses in order to correct for them, in order to, you know, to do what's right. And if we just pretend that we aren't, you know, kind of genetically programmed to operate in a certain way, if we pretend it's not real, then we can't really correct it, you know. Or work to mitigate it.
If we pretend it's not there, it's still there. It's just we don't we don't do anything about it. And then wonder why it keeps appearing. Thinking what's going on here. No, I did find Carole's book really it had a huge impact on me. Did that book about testosterone, as somebody who lived with, you know, high levels of testosterone for half my adult life, and now it's it's much lower. It's in the normal female range is my testosterone now, but I'm still the same person. And but I do react differently, but not differently. I guess the orientation has never changed. The direction of how I react hasn't changed. It's just that intensity, and that it was that as before I transitioned, like other men, if you're provoked to the point of reacting, you really have to apply every technique not to go and thump somebody or make an embarrassment out of yourself. Whereas now I'm things can wash off much more easily now. But I often say it's not the direct. It's just the intensity of the emotions that have changed. The emotions are still the same. They've just changed in intensity.
Yeah, and I suppose Aaron and I, we've had, that experience, but in the other direction, right? Is like, with the addition of testosterone, I started feeling anger physically. Like it wasn't just something that happened internally. It was like, I felt like I had to physically. I'm not violent at all, but like I still felt like I felt anger physically. But I wouldn't actually been thinking about this. Is I'm somewhere between the two of you, I think, because I had. I grew up, I was a hardcore tomboy growing up, very much gender nonconforming, gender dysphoric. And then at puberty, I was heterosexual. I was only attracted to men. But that feeling of I was supposed to be a boy, I want to be a boy, never went away. That continued until I was 27. I always talk about, I think I'm going to outgrow it, and I just never outgrow it. So then I was 27. Again, I've carried that shame of it with me all that time. And then when you hear with female to male transition is that the lesbians, the butch lesbians suddenly find themselves attracted to men. And I was like, weird, testosterone makes you attracted to men. That just makes no sense biologically, but obviously I'm already attracted to men, so nothing's going to change there. And then I start taking testosterone. I was on the 0.225, basically half the doses you'd normally be prescribed. And suddenly I became very attracted to women. The attraction to men was still there, but the attraction to women was very sudden, very intense, and probably took precedence over the attraction to men. And then a few years later, I was bumped up to the regular 0.5 dose, start taking that dose, and suddenly my attraction to men completely disappeared, and my attraction to women, or females in general, dramatic, like that was the soul. And so I was wondering, like, is this the testosterone? Like what happened here? But I'll go months sometimes for various reasons, months without taking testosterone, and the orientation directed at females doesn't change, but the intensity of it diminishes. Like men don't become attractive again when my testosterone lowers. So I do wonder what I imagine my base orientation has always been gynephilic, but the dysphoria, because I always wished I was a lesbian, it would explain my masculinity and everything like that. But I've just found female anatomy repulsive. I was just like, no, why would I duplicate this thing that's so disgusting on me? But once my sex drive turns way up, and I think there's also the placebo effect of dysphoria, lessening with the transition steps. Suddenly, like that, all that went away, and that envy I felt towards men, that envy and attraction, that went away. They kind of just didn't really, they were irrelevant after that. But yeah, so it's interesting. I keep hounding, the sexologists in our sphere. It's like, dude, female sexuality is so much more interesting than male sexuality. Why do you give this stuff so much attention?
Because I've never heard that happening with the HSTS trans women, where there were gay men, really effeminate gay men, they took estrogen, and now suddenly they're not like that. I've never heard that happening.
No, but the autogynephilic version happens. I don't think this was your experience, Debbie, but when you start transitioning, suddenly a lot of them develop a sexual attraction to men. But I think that's more sort of that pseudo bisexuality, where you're trying to validate, you're trying to complete that sense of self as a woman. And when I learned about all this, I was like, maybe I do have AAP, and my attraction to women is just a man of, but it's not like I'm completely neutral in my sexual attraction. It's like I'm irrelevant. So I don't think I'm using it definitely feels very like subconscious and natural, and not like a mental game I'm playing to validate something. But yeah, I definitely, kind of considered that possibility. But.
Yeah, I can see the pseudo bisexuality is interesting though, in that male to female transitions will transition, then become interested in men, and they say this is, well, is my sexual orientation changing? Whereas the theory is that the men they're not necessarily attracted to the men, but the men are part of the fantasy in order to validate them as women. So hence the term pseudo bisexuality, which makes a lot of sense, really.
Mm-hmm.
You see, I was very fortunate. I was married, and I'm still married, and we worked through it. So the partner and the need for that intimate relationship on a mental level, and was always, I never needed to go any, that was always there. I do, but for people who are transitioning male to female, though I keep getting into trouble for that terminology. I get said, you can't transition to female. I said, well, I know you can't become female, but it's a term that I use. But people who are doing that without a partner, without somebody to talk to be with, must be really difficult to try. You're doing this in a vacuum, and then you transition, then you find you don't fit in properly. Trying to find, for a male transsexual post transition, trying to find a partner, well, you're looking at a small pool of people, really. It's not, it's not great. It really isn't. I'm not sure what. But the concept of who we are and who we're attracted to and why is interesting. But again, it's something else that we don't really talk about.
No, and it really should be talked about, prior. There's lots that should be talked about prior to transition. I mean, one is how important is it to you to pass, is something that should be talked about. Because if someone has a physicality that they're probably never going to pass, and that is they're really hopeful that that's going to happen, and that would be a make or break their satisfaction with their transition, that really should be discussed with people beforehand.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to be. But the other is that sexuality and partnership aspect, because that seems to be one of the points that causes regret for people. Is, let's say they're a lesbian and are attracted to lesbians, they transition, they're still attracted to lesbians, but now lesbians aren't attracted to them, right? And now who's their dating pool? Are they going to date straight women? Like it becomes very confusing post transition.
Yeah, I guess you're looking for bisexual women who don't. But again, it's the pool of people. It's finding people, and it's not easy. But this is not talked about. As you said before, and we've created this concept of the trans person. You are trans, that you therefore must transition, and the consequences of it are just not considered at all, and they should be. When it comes to passing, there are, I think, two levels of passing. There's the passing where you're just taken for the opposite sex, and people are astonished when you come out to them. I do know a trans person who I didn't realize this person was transsexual. I just thought this person was a woman, and we were in a group of people, and I thought they were a partner, because there was some female partners there, you see, and no, I'm transsexual. I transitioned 30 years ago, and I think that level of passing is one thing, but there's also another level. It's putting across enough visual clues that when you pass people in the street, they may clock you as male transsexual, but there's enough signals there that not the illusion hold. Illusion's the wrong word for it, but it holds, and they can cope with this, and it fits into the worldview. If you can't get that far, then what does transition actually mean? If you can't do that, so if 2, 3, 4 years down the line, you're walking down the street and people see you as a man and don't see you as anything else, then what has transition actually meant? is it no more than a demand that people use these pronouns which are incongruent with perception of reality? Is that all it is? Well, that's not very satisfying, is it not? It's not satisfactory at all. So I do think we should be talking about this. I don't think you've got to get to the point where it's you're unclockable, but you do need to get to a point where you fit in with other people's perceptions of reality, because otherwise it's not going to work. It really isn't.
There do seem to be a fair number of people, and it seems to be increasing, that where they want to occupy that middle ground. They transition in order to seem ambiguous, and they're disappointed if they start to pass too much.
I think it's much more common though in the female transitioners than the male transitioners.
Yes.
No, so I see what Debbie was just describing, what you're saying about like when you're walking down the street and what is it that somebody perceives. It's like, I live in a progressive college city where there are a lot of clearly young people who are clearly female. They're presenting in quite a feminine way, actually, like makeup and what have you. They've got very deep voices and some other masculinization going on. So it's very clear. And a lot of them have he, him, or they, them, like, pins on them, Yeah. So it's very clear that they're trying, like they've taken medical steps, they've taken testosterone. Their voice sounds quite masculine, but they're clearly presenting in a very feminine way. And that seems to be the point. And it's like this just youth fad currently. And when I talk about detransitioners, and like mostly what we're seeing now is the binary detransitioners. There's like the say what the female transitioners is people who were intent on living as men, and then they were like, this is not what I wanted. This is not, for whatever reason, they realize they've made a mistake and they undo it. But so many more I'm seeing now that the trans has become so popular and such like this youth subculture to belong to, is so many of these people are like micro transitioning just for that trans label. And then what does regret of that look like? It's like, it's so abstract. Like what you've done is just like, I don't know how they're going to conceptualize that. I don't know what this reckoning is going to be, but there's just so many of them. And yeah, anyway, I just wonder what that's going to look like down the line.
Yeah, what's behind this? How does this help? How does it help anybody live their lives? That's want to know. If somebody wants to, shrug off the expectations on their sex, I'd say go for it. Sometimes I make jokes about people with blue-colored hair and the like, but that people have always colored. Young people have colored their hair. When I was young, people used to. I never did. I was not the sort of thing for me, but others did. And if people want to use they them pronouns in some ways, that you think, well, what's the big deal? There's two things that bother me. One is the insistence that everybody else joins in your particular worldview, which I don't think we can do that. I think we've always got to compromise in what we want and what everybody else wants. But secondly, there is this, what I worry is the attraction for, it's the medical transition. If you're really serious, there's the steps along here. And then it's young people seeking out medical transition before they're in a position where they can really understand what it means and understand what it means to be an adult. That's what worries me there. If it was simply just the latest expression of, youth culture, then fine, not particularly bothered about that. As long as you still do your work and you still you still do the chores and you do what's necessary, because we've all got to we've all got to do our bit here. That's where I'd come from there. But there's nothing special about this. You're just somebody who was, who doesn't fit those stereotypes perhaps a little more strongly than others. But creating this special idea that there are trans people and this special non-binary people as somewhat set apart from everybody else, then I think we're fooling, that people are fooling themselves and trying to fool each other there.
Yeah. I remember 15 years ago when I transitioned, there was a lot more assessment then. And I remember filling out quite lengthy screening forms, and they would ask questions about sexual fantasies and who are your partners. And I remember there were people in the community that really pushed back on that. And they were framing it as, oh, this doctor is such a pervert that they're asking questions about sex and my fantasies and who I want to have sex with. And unfortunately, it seems like what the medical community has done is they took that criticism to heart and they eliminated all of that rather than helping us to understand why those questions are important and what the purpose of those questions are, because we didn't really have many trans elders 15, 20 years ago to help us understand, well, it's kind of important to think through that, because if you don't, you end up in this situation. So we've really lost a lot. We've done such a disservice, I think, to this generation to not be able to guide them according to what we've learned as people that have been through this and have just eliminated all of that instead.
Yeah, we've talked about gender identity and how I think it's unhelpful. I think we share those ideas. We've talked about gender dysphoria, but what what that actually means. But fundamentally, what's the core of this? There is some medical treatment. That's what there is. Whatever diagnosis we put there to access it is less important than the fact, is this treatment going to improve somebody's life? If it's improving somebody's life, then there's an argument for it. But if it's not going to improve somebody's life, then why have some treatment if it's not going to improve your life and actually make your life worse? And I fear what's happening in case, well, we see it with detransitioners who are saying this overtly, but people are having treatment and it's not improving their lives. And those sort of questions which you spoke about there, Aaron, those are the questions which we need to ask in order to discern, will this treatment improve your life or not? If we don't ask those questions, we don't know.
Yeah, and if it's a young person that's never had a relationship, they're probably not thinking those aspects of it through. I mean, transition impacts different dimensions of our lives, right? It impacts our social lives and our friends, our families, our partnerships, and those different domains of functioning, I think, need to be examined and addressed and thought through before transition. And I don't think a young person has the capacity to do that if they don't have the life experience to have experienced any of those dimensions.
Yeah, they don't, and the consequences of it. And I sometimes talk about having children of our own, and I know that's not the be all and end all of it. But we don't allow children to present themselves at 15 and say, "I don't want any children of my own, so can I be sterilized now, please? Can I have a vasectomy now?" We don't permit that. But going beyond that, it is building relationships, and within society, and relationships work both ways. We can't demand of the rest of the humanity that build relationships with us as we want. It's always a two-way process. And if somebody's presenting in such a way that everybody else will take two steps back from, then is that helping that individual? Because we can make all sorts of constructs in our head, but we are social beings, and we need our relationships with each other. We do need those things. And if by these processes people are cutting themselves off from relationships with others, then is it improving their life? That's always the question that we need to be asking.
Absolutely.
Great conversation.
Yeah. Well, it's lovely. I say it's lovely to meet you two. Yeah, the two Aarons. Yeah. We've chatted. We've sent messages to each other, but this is the first time we've actually talked to each other, which is really good. Thank you.
Yeah, a long time coming.
Yeah.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much, Debbie.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.